Hey, it's Vanessa, the Crafty Gemini, and this tutorial is actually kicking off my new series of tutorials that I'm calling Clothes from Clothes. Basically, I'm showing you how to take items of clothing that you already have, gonna trace around them, and we're gonna turn them into patterns to then use that to create new articles of clothing. To kick off the series, we're starting off real simple. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to take a plain onesie that you may already have for your child, and I'm going to teach you how to turn that into a pattern and then use it to make a tank top or a tank top dress. So let's jump right into our project. So the first thing we need is the onesie that we plan to use as our pattern piece. This is a onesie that my daughter wears very often, comfortable, just stretch, 100% cotton, and I know it fits her nicely, so I want to use this. Make sure that you're choosing a onesie that's already been worn and washed, because some stretch knit fabrics have been known to shrink as much as 10%. So you definitely don't want to start with fabric that hasn't been washed, because then after you make it to size and you wash it, it's going to shrink up on you. So you want to wash both the item that you're using to make your pattern out of, and then also the fabric that you'll be using to create the new piece that you'll be using from this pattern. So there are a few different ways that you can trace around this onesie to make your pattern. Some people like to use cardboard like this, just scrap piece of cardboard. I don't like to have a template as thick as this cardboard. This is kind of cumbersome to cut around, things like that. So I'll show you all what I like to do, and that's using just a piece of poster board. This is really inexpensive. You can buy a huge little sheet for like 30 cents or 50 cents. So this is great for pattern making because it's nice and stiff. So what I like to do is take my onesie and lay it flat on my poster board here. And I'm just going to put some of my fabric weights. I have a tutorial on how to make these. I'll link right here to it if you want to learn how to make these little fabric weights as well. And then what I'll do is take this really cute little tracing wheel, and you can see the difference between the two. One is a whole lot sharper than the other. The sharpest one is the one that I prefer to use because with very little pressure, it will pass on my markings right down to my poster board. The one that has less points here, that's a little bit less sharp, what you want to do is simply just press a little bit harder as you're tracing to try and get these more blunt spokes to come through to your poster board paper. But either one will do. If you want to get one like mine, I'll include a link in the video description box below so you know where I got it. Okay, so we're headed back to our piece here. And what we're going to do is put some weights around the areas that we're going to be tracing around so it doesn't move as much on us. And what you want to do is simply take your tracing wheel and you're going to trace around these seam lines. Now we'll start here at the neckline. What you want to do is trace at the seam line where the body fabric connects to the neckline ribbing here, because we're actually going to add our own neckline ribbing here, so we don't want to account for that in our pattern piece. We want to simply go along. Now I want to go down my shoulder seam here, right like that. Then I'm going to stop. I'm going to come down around this arm opening. In this project, we're not including the sleeves since this is going to be a tank top. And I want to keep it nice and simple for beginners. So I'm going to come up this way. Again, right along that seam line. We will be adding seam allowance to our pattern, okay? So we'll account for that later. Right now, we just want to get the shape of it. And if you have to go over it a couple of times, no big deal. Now we want to come down here. And then the length of this pattern is really going to depend on what you want it to be. Whether it's a tank top or you want to turn it into a dress for a little girl, you can just adjust the length accordingly. And also if you want it to bow out a little bit or you want it to be straight, that's really up to you. You can eyeball it from here. So coming back up here, notice I started from the center out. What I'm going to do is actually just measure this in half so I know where to stop, because I want my pattern piece to be just a piece that looks like this. I don't want it to be full, because what I'm going to do is lay this part on my folded fabric so that once it's opened, the full front of the tank top is going to be exactly symmetrical. So we'll fold this over carefully here. And then I'll just make a quickie mark right there that I know that that's the center mark, and I can draw that all the way down a straight angle. So you can faintly see here the neckline up to the shoulder, around the arm opening. And so now I'm going to go back with my rulers and trace this so they can show up a little bit better. To trace around my dots here, there are just two rulers that you're going to need. whenever you're working with necklines or armholes, you want to have some kind of a French curve ruler. This is one that I get from my friend Crafty Bev. She's actually local here where I live, and she's a quilting friend of mine who also has her husband design different types of templates and rulers. And so this is a mini version of a curvy, it's called Curvy, of a curved ruler. I'll include a link in the description box below where you can get this, and so I'll show you how it works. I'm going to line up my curvy ruler with the curve of my armhole here. And since I traced this freehand, right, with my tracing wheel, I'm just going to try to get it as close as I can get it to a curve on my ruler. I'm going to take a permanent marker. And trace right there. Then you can either use the straight edge of the curvy ruler or just a straight quilting ruler as well. And so I'm just going to follow my dots. Now I'm coming up to the neckline curve. I also have my mark here, which shows me that this is the halfway mark, okay, where I want my pattern to come straight down. So I'll turn my ruler over so I can get this neckline curve here. Depending on whatever length you decide, go ahead and add another 1.5 inches or so just for your hemline at the bottom. And this is just roughly, okay, I'm just estimating. Once you make one like this and you use your pattern to create your actual tank top, you'll get a better feel for how articles of clothing actually come together. And I think a tank top is a great little project to start with, especially for kids, because you're not going to use that much fabric. Even if you mess up, it won't be wasted. So what I'm going to do now is I want to make sure that this line is going to be exactly 90 degrees. Now I know that my poster board is straight because this is how it came off, just off the whole sheet. I haven't cut this bottom edge here. So what I'm going to do is line up my mark up here and then line up one of the marks on my ruler with that bottom edge of the poster board. So I know it's nice and straight, okay? And I'm just going to draw this line straight down because we definitely want our center line to be completely straight and a 90-degree angle. And I'm just going to draw a straight line across. Again, I'm lining up one of the lines on my ruler with the bottom edge of the poster board so that I know that now this line is completely straight. Okay, so there is my general pattern piece. So what we need to do now is, before we cut this out, we want to add our seam allowance, right, in the appropriate spaces, because not everything is going to take a seam allowance. What we do need to do is add a seam allowance on this outside, right, because we have 2 pieces of fabric that are going to be sewn. So this is a good way to gauge where you need to add seam allowance. Consult with the original pattern that you traced, okay, the original onesie, and look to see, is there a seam line here? Yes, that means I need to add seam allowance here because I'm going to sew there. Do we need to add seam allowance here? No, because we're not adding a sleeve, we're going to add our binding. So this can be just like it is. Do we have a seam up here at the shoulder? Yes, we do. So we got to add some seam allowance there. The neckline, remember, we're not adding seam allowance because we're going to add our own binding. And then, like I said, to the center front or center back, there's no seam allowance here. You're going to throw the proportions of your pattern piece out if you add anything to this side. And then to the bottom here, we've adjusted it to whatever length we wanted, and we're going to add whatever we want for our hem at the bottom. So, looks like I only need to add seam allowance in 2 spots, on the side seam and on the shoulder seam. Okay? So, you're going to adjust the seam allowance to whatever you want it to be. If you know that from the center of your needle on your machine to where you like to stitch is 1/2 inch, go ahead and use 1/2 inch. Traditionally, in garment making, your seam allowance is going to be 5/8 inch. If that's what you're used to, go ahead and add that, whatever you want. I don't recommend, however, that you use a small seam allowance, like 1/4 inch, unless you're using like a walking foot on your machine, which I recommend, because sometimes when the seam allowance is too thin or too narrow, you won't really be able to get a good bite on the fabric, and sometimes the machine will start eating the fabric. So just give yourself some space. Since you're creating the pattern, you can add whatever seam allowance you want. I'm going to add 1/2 inch just to be safe. And so here's what I've done. I put my 1/2 inch mark line on the black line of what the finished pattern is going to look like, right here. And then I've just drawn a straight line 1/2 inch over. And all you need to do, real simple, is connect the lines. And you can just continue that right there. And then this one too, okay? So there's my seam allowance there. And now I need to add some to this side seam. So we'll do a 1/2 inch as well. Lining up my 1/2 inch mark on the black line that I've already traced out. And again, okay. So now our pattern piece is ready to be cut out. And you want to cut out along this outside line. For the curves, I use my rotary cutter too because I have a steady hand. If you don't feel comfortable, go ahead and use a pair of scissors. Notice what I'm doing. I'm keeping the rotary cutter down and I'm turning the pattern piece as I go. This helps me keep the nice curvature of that armhole. This is a long straight line, so I'll put my ruler on again. And here, you can have this a little bit slanted. If you plan to make a dress, I bowed it out just a little bit. But for the bottom hem here, you can just adjust it how you want it. This can be a straight line. It can bow out a little bit. Once you do one as a practice piece, you'll get a better idea and then decide, what look you prefer. Once you've made your pattern piece, before you do anything else or put it away and you forget what you have here, you want to make sure that you write out the information on this pattern piece. So first of all, we know that looking at our fabric here, the onesie that we use, the stretch goes this way. There's a little stretch this way, but mostly it's side to side. So we want to put a straight arrow going side to side to remind us, I'll put stretch, to remind us that when we're cutting out this pattern on our fabric, we want to lay it so that the stretch is going left to right. Then another thing you want to write here is that this is going to be put on the fold of your fabric. Make a straight line here and point 2 little arrows down just so that I remind myself, hey, this edge here needs to be put on the fold. Now because this is for a tank top, I'm going to keep it real simple and we're not going to do different necklines. Meaning, on most articles of clothing, you'll see that the front neckline part is lower than the back one. You see that this is higher up here and this one scoops down lower in the front. Because it's a tank top and I want to keep it real basic for our first project in this series, we're going to use this one pattern piece to cut out both the front and the back, just the same. So our pattern piece is ready to go. One other thing that I recommend you put on here is basically look to see the size of the clothing that you're using and then write it in here. And so I'll just remind myself here and I'll put 9 to 12 months. So if you ever want to use it again or make some for gifts, you have your pattern piece right here. Okay, we've taken a onesie, we've created our own pattern piece from it. Now we can put that away and now we have a pattern here that's going to be used to make all kinds of tank tops and tank top dresses. You can use this for boys and girls, whatever you want.